Welcome back to Yehoshua's Daf Yomi Shiur, where the Daf continues daily until the complete revelation of Mashiach ben David, Messiah son of David. Now, since I lost the place last Amud, this is rare, but I think I'm going to do a part B. So I don't want to start from the beginning. I already did 9 minutes or so in the last Amud. I don't want that to go to waste. So I'll tell you where we were. I went to the video. I found the place where I was, and where the words Shomer lahachnis ulehotzi. That's where we were. Okay, so we'll start from there. This is part B of Amud Aleph, of side A. So that's what we'll do. And I was doing last year, maybe 2 years ago, I was doing a lot of part A's and part B's. So this is just maybe like a reminder of like 2 years, a year and a half ago or so, I was doing part A, part B. So this is part B. Part 2. Okay, Shomer lahachnis l'tzorach kal v'chomer miyad asi miyad uma yad she'enu magina mechneses matzia shomer l'kol shchein. A verse is not needed to derive the protection both in parts and exports impurity. This halach is inferred by kal v'chomer from the halach of a handle. If a handle which is treated more leniently than protection because it does not perfect the food. Nevertheless, both imports and exports impurity, then with regard to protection, which is treated more stringently than a handle because it protects the food, should it not all the more so import and export impurity? Shomer, dikasa Rahman Lamali, Shemamino Litzarek. Since this is so, why do I need the verse? That the merciful one writes from which it is derived that protection is considered part of the food with regard to ritual impurity, meaning the verses, upon any sowing seed that is sown, it is impure for you. Leviticus 11:37-38 conclude from these verses that protection not only imparts impurity, but even joins together with the food to constitute the requisite measure to impart impurity. The Gemara challenges, but say that these verses should be interpreted differently. A handle, which is treated more leniently than protection, is considered part of the food such that it imports but does not export impurity. Protection, which is treated more stringently than a handle, is considered like food to import and export impurity, but it is not derived that a handle exports impurity, nor that protection joins together with the food to constitute the requisite measure to impart impurity. Yad lehachnis v'lo lehosi, yad lehachnis v'lo lehotzi v'lo lo matisam l'chashta ayole me'alia apokim voye. The Gemara explains you cannot say that a handle is considered part of the food such that it imports but does not export impurity for the following reason. Now that the handle is considered part of the food with regard to importing impurity into the food, is it necessary to state that it exports impurity? If a handle can cause ritually pure food attached to it to become impure, certainly it can transmit the impurity of impure food attached to it to other foods. Consequently, since a handle both imports and exports impurity, it is inferred via kal v'chomer that protection also imports and exports impurity. It is therefore derived from the verse concerning appendages that serve as protection, that protection joins together with the food to constitute the requisite measure to impart impurity. Ve'ema yad lehotzi v'lo lehachnis. Shomer lehotzi v'lehachnis, aval yad lehachnis v'shomer litzarech v'lo. The Gemara challenges, but say instead that a handle which is treated more leniently than protection is considered part of the food such that it exports but does not import impurity. Protection, which is treated more stringently than a handle, both exports and imports impurity, but it is not derived that a handle imports impurity, nor that protection joins together with the food to constitute the requisite measure to impart impurity. The Gemara explains there is an additional derivation with regard to a handle, as it is written with regard to the impurity of vessels, and everything upon which any part of their carcass falls shall be impure, whether an oven or a range for pots, shall be broken in pieces. They're impure and shall be impure for you. Leviticus 11:35. Lachem lechol shebitzorchechem l'rabos is hayedos. It is derived from the term for you that any part needed for your use of a vessel has the impurity status of the vessel itself, including the handles. Therefore, if the vessel comes into contact with a source of impurity, the handle is considered part of the vessel and is also rendered impure. Consequently, there are two derivations with regard to a handle. One teaches that a handle imports impurity into the object to which it is attached, and the other teaches that a handle exports impurity from the object. It is derived through a kal v'chomer inference from the halacha of a handle that protection both imports and exports impurity, and therefore the verse that states upon any sowing seed teaches that protection joins together with the food to constitute the requisite measure to impart impurity. The Gemara asks, with regard to these three verses that are interpreted as referring to handles, one of which discusses the impurity of food, one of which discusses the impurity of vessels, and one of which discusses the impurity of carcasses, which of them is superfluous, such that one can derive from it that a handle does not really export impurity from the food, but imports impurity to the food as well? All of these verses are necessary to teach that a handle exports impurity. The Gemara elaborates on the question. Let the merciful one write that a handle exports impurity with regard to the impurity of seeds, meaning food, and let those matters, meaning that it exports the impurity of vessels and animal carcasses, be derived from it. But one cannot infer from the impurity of food that a handle exports the impurity of vessels, as what is notable about seeds. It is notable in that they have a greater susceptibility to impurity. Food is susceptible to even second degree impurity, whereas vessels are susceptible to only first degree impurity. Likewise, one cannot derive from the impurity of food that a handle exports the impurity of an animal carcass, because the impurity of food applies to more items, as it is taught in the Mishnah that some items are susceptible to the impurity of food, but not to the impurity of animal carcasses. Lichtov Rachman al-Batanar, Lesihanak Minei Malatanar Shekim Tameh Me Aviro. Let the merciful one write that a handle exports impurity with regard to the impurity of an oven, meaning vessels, let those matters, meaning that it exports the impurity of food and the impurity of an animal carcass, be derived from it. But this inference is also not valid as what is notable about the impurity of an oven. It is notable in that a vessel transmits impurity to foods, not only through contact, but also through its airspace, whereas those other types of impurity do not share this element of stringency. Let the merciful one write that a handle exports impurity with regard to the impurity of an animal carcass, and let those matters, meaning that it exports the impurity of food and of vessels, be derived from it. But this inference is also not valid, as what is notable about the impurity of a carcass, it is notable in that a carcass transmits impurity to a person and transmits impurity to one carrying the carcass, even if he is not touching it, and its impurity emanates from its body and does not originate from an external source. Those other types of impurity do not share these elements of stringency. The Gemara answers the halacha of one of these three types of ritual impurity cannot be derived from the halacha of any one of the others. Yet one of the verses is still superfluous, because one can derive the halacha of one of these three types from the other two. Hi Tesi. Lo dichtav Rahman Bizroim Tesi Mehanach Ma Lahanach Shehin B'Tam Shelo B'Hechsher Tom Bizroim Mishim B'Tam Ela B'Hechsher. The Gemara asks, which can one derive from the other two? Let the merciful one not write that a handle exports impurity with regard to the impurity of seeds, meaning food, and derive this halacha from the other two cases, the impurity of carcasses and the vessels. But this inference is not valid, as what is notable about those cases? They are notable in that they become ritually impure without first being rendered susceptible to impurity by coming into contact with liquid. Shall you say the same halacha with regard to seeds, which do not share this element of stringency, as food can become impure only after first being rendered susceptible to impurity by coming into contact with liquid? Rav Huna, the son of Yehoshua, said, This element of leniency is not unique to the impurity of food. Produce that is not rendered susceptible to impurity by coming into contact with liquid is equivalent to an oven whose construction is not complete. An oven whose construction is incomplete is also not susceptible to impurity. Rather, refute this derivation in the following manner. What is notable about those cases of impurity of carcasses and vessels? They are notable in that they become impure even without contact. An oven becomes impure if a creeping animal is within its airspace, and the impurity of an animal carcass originates from its own body without contact with an external source. Shall you state the same halacha with regard to seeds, which become impure only through contact? Lo, let the merciful one not write that a handle exports impurity with regard to the impurity of an oven, meaning the vessels, and derive this halacha from those cases. Impurity of food and carcasses, but this derivation is not valid, as what is notable about those cases of the impurity of food and carcasses? They are notable in that they are food. Therefore, their halachot cannot necessarily be applied to an oven and other vessels that are not food. Lo, l'tov rachman ben nevela v'teis mehanach enachinami eliyad de nevela lamali im enon inyan liyad nevela tanehu inyan liyad de amna. Let the merciful one not write that a handle exports impurity with regard to a carcass, and derive this halacha from those cases of the impurity of food and vessels. The Gemara responds, yes, it is indeed so. Rather, since one can derive in such a manner that a handle is attached to a carcass and imparts impurity, why do I need the verse to state the halacha of a handle with regard to the impurity of a carcass? If it is not needed for the matter of a handle with regard to the impurity of a carcass, apply to it the matter of a handle in general with regard to food, and derive from it that a handle imports impurity to the food. Therefore, in summary, one can derive that the handle imports impurity and that a handle exports impurity. One can infer that protection imports and exports impurity a fortiori from the halacha of a handle. It is therefore derived from the verse concerning protection that protection joins together with the food to constitute the requisite measure to impart impurity. The Gemara challenges, but it is still necessary. No, but is it still necessary for the verse to state the halacha that a handle exports impurity with regard to the impurity of a carcass? As if the merciful one had not written the halacha of a handle with regard to impurity of a carcass, I would say it is sufficient for the conclusion that emerges from an a fortiori inference to be like its source. In this case, a halacha with regard to the impurity of carcasses, which is inferred a fortiori from the cases of impurity of food and impurity of vessels, is no more stringent than the source from which it is derived. Just as handles in these cases of impurity of food and vessels do not transmit impurity to a person, so too the handle of a carcass does not transmit impurity to a person. Therefore, the verse from which it is derived that a handle exports the impurity of a carcass is necessary and cannot be applied to the matter of importing impurity. The Gemara answers, rather, it is necessary for the verse to state the halacha of a handle with regard to the impurity of a carcass, but it is not necessary for the verse to state the halacha of protection with regard to the impurity of a carcass. With regard to what halacha does the merciful one write that verse? If it is teaching that protection joins together with the carcass to constitute the requisite measure to impart impurity, you said that protection does not join together with the carcass to constitute the requisite measure to impart impurity, and if it is teaching that protection exports the impurity of the carcass, it is not necessary to teach that, because that halacha is inferred through a kal v'chomer from the halacha of a handle. Ella im ein linyan shomer nevela teneu inyan liad nevela, im eno inyan liad nevela teneu inyan liad de alma yad lahotzi yad lachnis v'shomer tzaf l'tzaref. Rather, if it is not needed for the matter of protection of a carcass, apply to it the matter of the handle of a carcass. And if it is not needed for the matter of the handle of a carcass, apply to it the matter of a handle in general, and derive from it that a handle imports impurity. Therefore, in summary, one can derive that a handle exports impurity and that a handle imports impurity, and one can derive from the verse concerning protection with regard to the impurity of food that protection joins together with the food to constitute the requisite measure to impart impurity.